Welcome to the Blockchain All-Star Series. I'm your host, Layla Gulen. Blockchain and distributed ledger technology are at the forefront of the Internet 3.0 era, where the technology can enable trusted and transparent sharing, data, and digital assets. Though the technology is still at its early stage, who makes up the constellation of innovators guiding us through the digital revolution powered by blockchain? Well, our guest is David Shin. He's an entrepreneur and a former banker who's been involved in several startups around the world. He's also an active community builder who has helped set up nonprofit organizations in Asia to ensure proper engagement with local, regional entities and officials as it relates to cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology. Well, David, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So as a banker, you most recently worked for TD Bank as their Asia head of global equity derivatives and repo sales, and then became their key crypto expert. Let's start there. Tell us a little bit more about your entree into the banking world.
Yeah, I like most Asian kids growing up, wanted to do other things, but Asian parents have a way of convincing their children to get into industries that either pay well or that are pretty prestigious. So I was never really sort of preconditioned to be a doctor or a lawyer. So the natural thing for me was to go into banking. So I really didn't start my banking career till I left Canada. So I'm Korean by heritage, but was raised in Canada since I was 3 years old. So I grew up very differently than most of my friends who live out here in Asia. I grew up with an ice hockey stick and a cup of Tim Hortons in my hand, and went to a school called Waterloo. And so it was very interesting, sort of my academic background, having hockey player and an athlete. My parents were really insistent that I went to a school called Waterloo, which was very engineering and technical. Looking back on it, it was very helpful in my banking career.
Interesting. And when you moved to Asia, did you feel that you were at the same, up to speed, at the same level as your peers, or was there any catching up to do?
Yeah, at that young age, I was in my 20s at the time when I've been in Asia for 20 years now. Yeah, a lot of guys and girls starting out in their 20s in banking, they just take a lot of, flack, and it really, I don't want to say that it's a bit of a dog race, but it's more about who can last longer and who can really just play the political mind game, which is what, to me, banking was in my early days. It was just really about trying to meet the right managers, do the right things, make as much money as I could. I mean, if I'm honest, those were the things that were at the forefront of my mind. I was based in Japan, Tokyo. This is all before the pre-financial crisis of '08, and people were more interested in just coming to the office, getting paid, and then having a good time than they were about, how far they were going with their careers, at least the peers that were in my group. So it wasn't really till, I started, at moving into the VP level and above, director level, where, I was more focused in on how far can I go with this. But thankfully in 2012, I found Bitcoin, and my life changed since then.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought that up. Why don't we start talking about Bitcoin? Because unlike, I think, a lot of people in your industry, you then started to dive headfirst into cryptocurrencies, which today is more and more on the lips of just your everyday layman who's interested in potentially investing in cryptocurrencies. So tell us about that transition.
Yeah, I was, so I moved around a lot because of banking. So from Tokyo, I went to Singapore, and then I went to Hong Kong. It was in 2012. I was with Barclays at the time. A friend of mine who worked for Goldman Sachs, he asked me to go out for a beer. We had a beer in Lang Kwai Fong, and then he said to me, "Have you heard of this thing called Bitcoin?" It was February 2012. I said, "No, what the hell's that?" told me to go and read whatever I could that was online about it. And the only thing that was online at the time was Satoshi's white paper. I just fell in love with this idea of being able to have the Byzantine general's problem solved, a well-written white paper on how to implement that technologically, and then having the world starting to contribute to that from an open source perspective. So that was really the initial journey, the genesis of decentralization. Once you get through solving that problem and having open source developers to build the solution around it.
So we're talking now 10 years since you first discovered Bitcoin. So what would you say have been some of the most significant developments since then to today in 2022, as far as cryptocurrency Bitcoin are concerned?
Yeah, I started out as an ASIC miner. And I felt the texture of Bitcoin. It was not nice. So I never really thought it could be used for payments, which was really the first use case that most people were thinking of when it came to Bitcoin. In fact, a lot of people who know me from the early days, they know that I immediately jumped in 2013 after mining into Ripple, because I looked at Ripple and I thought this was much better in terms of the technology and the architecture for payments. And so it was at that point I started my first startup, first and last, called Paywise. It got a lot of attention because I was really one of the few that was pounding the table about using Ripple to disrupt SWIFT. I felt that there was a real opportunity there coming from the banking industry, that SWIFT users were paying a lot of money, the banks were paying a lot of money. Settlement was all done over SWIFT, and I thought, what if we could do this using Ripple as a backbone? And so that got the attention of some people at the Ripple head office, including Chris Larson, who is one of the main founders of Ripple. They flew me into San Francisco in the second half of 2013. I really got to know sort of the people involved in Ripple, and really continue to sort of push them to look at Ripple, disrupting SWIFT. Because at that point in time, Layla, to be honest with you, they were not looking at cross-border transactions as a use case. Their focus in 2013 was really incentivizing developers around the world to set up what they called XRP gateways, which were just fiat on-ramps and off-ramps to create liquidity around the world and then connect those through their network. But they weren't really focused in on cross-border transactions and settlement through Ripple.
That's interesting. You as a banker are kind of a part of an elite group of people who have adopted the idea of cryptocurrency, it would seem. And it's not just a knowledge base and a theory behind digital assets, but it's also the technology behind it. So was there a learning curve for you at all to kind of get on board and really truly understand the technology behind cryptocurrency?
Was there a learning curve? There was and there wasn't. I mean, I think when you really like something, it's kind of like, my kids, sometimes they buy Lego sets that are probably above their age bracket, but they just figure it out. They sit there and they go through it because they really like it. I think I had one of those moments figuring out, the mining process of Bitcoin, but also to really go through the nitty-gritty details of Ripple and how they were set up. Mm-hmm. And it was good because going through it in the early days, for instance, with Bitcoin, it made me realize that eventually there would be scaling problems because at that time in 2012, early 2013, really there were no altcoins, is what we used to call them. Anything that wasn't Bitcoin, we called them altcoins. And the first altcoin, I think, was Litecoin. And, I started noticing that a lot of these altcoins were jamming transactions back into the Bitcoin blockchain through this field that is the only sort of open field called OP_return. Until this day, this is how sort of, as I understand it, Ethereum kind of came up with Ethereum because they forked Bitcoin, and Vitalik just uses Turing Complete as a scripting language to jam transactions back in through OP_return. So this was the whole idea of Ethereum at the time. It's evolved obviously into something much more different now, but back then that was the big idea, was you can use scripting language sort of real time to be able to make changes back into the chain. And so obviously, looking at that, I think most people, having spent whatever amount of time they did, mining, you'd realize that there was going to be some sort of scaling problem if a lot of altcoins came and started doing this, jamming transactions back in through this OP_return. And that's effectively what happened to Bitcoin, right? Oh, wow. As the altcoins increased, it started jamming up.
And going back to the technology and learning about cryptocurrency and really making it a part of your new mission, as it were, in your career, you're also credited with writing a draft response to the Canadian regulators on behalf of TD Bank on how cryptocurrencies should be regulated in Canada. So it's not just convincing yourself that this is the way of the future, but it's also convincing others. So how did you go about doing that? And what was the initial response? And what has been the path since then?
Yeah, the management at TD Bank, they asked me to, the regulator in Canada went around to all the big banks, TD, RBC, CIBC, et cetera, BMO. And I think they all asked for some sort of draft response to a list of questions that they had in terms of how, they should regulate crypto in Canada. For me, it was pretty natural. And the management team there, senior management, asked me to kind of take a look at it, give my initial view, and then the compliance team reviewed it and they felt that it was good enough to send. So that was the process. I had been in equities for a long time prior to that. So being a regulated, licensed salesperson in Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Canada at the time, you kind of get a good understanding of what you can and can't do when it comes to equities and some of the reasons why, right? And so when you think about crypto, there's some difference, but not that much. I think more or less it's really about the underlying and how crypto is a little bit more, you have to be more of a technocrat than perhaps, for one to understand equities. But there are a lot of similarities, and just applying sort of my securities licensing type of learnings that I did and applying them into crypto, it made it quite straightforward for me.
Mm-hmm. I want to get into Tezos in just a moment here, but where we sit now with cryptocurrency, what do you see for the future of it? I mean, is it something that you think a large portion of the world is going to get on board and start using? Is this going to really become the decentralized nature of this currency? Is it really going to become something that all of us are going to eventually use at some point or another in our lifetimes?
Are you asking specifically about Tezos or blockchain in general?
No. Blockchain and just cryptocurrencies in general.
Yeah, no, I do. I think this is only the beginning of mass adoption, because what's happened is the governments and regulators have realized that the benefits of this is bigger than just the financial side of things. There's also the traceability and monitoring aspect. I mean, people say all the time how incredible the blockchain is for being able to trace back transactions. So you can't really money launder. And it's true. And the government's picked up on this. So at the end of the day, as draconian as it sounds, if one of the G7s really wanted to monitor where every tax dollar was moving to, then this is a really good way of doing it. If you were in a nirvana state in terms of what the government sees it as, and everyone was on a blockchain and using central bank digital currencies, you could effectively track and trace a lot of movement of money. And so, for someone who sits on sort of the regulation side, but also has a bit of this libertarian in me, which is why I really like Bitcoin. It's a struggle, but I think it's something that's inevitable, quite frankly.
Right. And how far do you think we are from regulation?
I think we're very close. I think we're, any one of us who are reading the headlines, we're starting to hear the noise coming out of the U.S. In terms of, not just the central bank, but also the Treasury, and even President Biden, coming up with a task force and pressing forward with this. So, and having some friends in Washington as well, I'm hearing that this is being talked about a lot more than it is in the press. So I strongly believe that there's some work, or at least discussions being had in the U.S. about EU-US dollar as well, and that at some stage there'll be a lot more public announcements about what the U.S. government intends to do with their own CBDC.
Okay. Well, a couple of years ago, you became an advisor to the Tezos Foundation. Tell us what the Tezos Foundation is all about and what you do there.
I was there for a couple of years. They initially asked me to come in and help them restructure Asia for them. Tezos they raised a lot of money during I think they raised the second most amount of money behind EOS during the ICO sort of boom days. And, really they had a strong presence in the US and Europe, but Asia was not necessarily where they wanted it to be. So they asked me to come in and help them sort of reevaluate and restructure Asia. So really my role was to sort of deconstruct what they had already in place that wasn't working, or what they thought wasn't working, and then reconstruct a new entity out of Singapore, build a new team, and start really pushing Asia adoption, so to speak, with users, investors, as well as developers. So that's what I did for about 2 years there.
Oh, okay. And you recently left to join Klaytn. So tell us more about Klaytn and what you do there today.
Sure. Klaytn is, there's a huge company called Kakao in Korea. Kakao is, they started out as sort of the WeChat of Korea. So over 95% of the Korean population is on a chat application called Kakao. Kakao then evolved from a chat application into a super app. And today you can do everything from shop to play games to ride hailing to all sorts of stuff, payments and all these types of things through the Kakao application. They are by market cap the second largest company in Korea behind Samsung. Wow. So they're very large. So Klaytn is Kakao's blockchain. Klaytn was launched in 2019. It's an EVM equivalent blockchain, which means that we are equivalent to Ethereum in terms of our engineering DNA. Layer one chain. We tend to focus in on bringing use cases that are focused in on gaming, as well as Metaverse, as well as creator economies. So anything that's related to the NFT. So we do a lot of this, primarily out of Asia at the moment, but we are currently expanding into other regions. And that's why I was hired. I was essentially brought in by the vice chairman of Kakao Group, who's one of the co-founders, and really was brought in to do the global expansion.
I was going to ask you if there's a platform here in the US that's similar to that. And do you imagine that Klaytn will eventually come to the United States?
Yeah, in the US, there isn't anything really that comparable at the moment. So yeah, we see that as an opportunity, actually. And so yes, I mean, to answer your second question, we are looking at the US. It's I think most Asian companies, regardless of whether they're a blockchain organization or a car manufacturer or TV manufacturer, they all seem to face similar challenges, which is they're challenged in terms of coming up with the right rhythm and dynamic when it comes to marketing, when it comes to partnerships in working with US-based companies. Part of it is, I think, a language thing. Another part of it is a cultural thing. And so really for us, and myself being a native English speaker from Canada, my approach in particular to the US is really about finding one or two really strong partners that where we're very symmetric in terms of our goals and our priorities, and working with them to really find the right areas to expand and grow in, whether it be Northeast US, Northwest or South, or, we don't want to try and swallow the whole thing in one shot. So we do have a couple of partners there, one partner that is already in place, another one that we are lining up. And so, we are anticipating that we'll be more present in the US over the next few months.
Okay. And you said the gaming is a big portion of that business. So would you say that GameFi is still a very important focus for Klaytn?
Yeah, gaming is really, we kind of look at anything that is virtual and that has an economic palette. Gaming is a natural sort of extension to blockchain, in a sense that it's a virtual environment. There are transactions that happen. The only problem is you can't settle those transactions because there's really no exit liquidity in games. So what I mean by that is, if you're playing Roblox or Fortnite or Minecraft, you can go from fiat on-ramp into the game, but you can't off-ramp that. And so this is the biggest challenge I think that games face. And this is therefore the biggest opportunities for blockchain, is to create gaming assets that allow you to come in-game and then on-chain. And having that corridor to be able to do that seamlessly, I think, gives you the exit that the whole gaming industry needs, actually, in order for their valuations to go up.
And if I'm understanding this correctly, because again, I have to remind you that I'm one of those lay people I was talking about earlier. So when you're talking about sort of this play to earn notion and the on-ramping versus not being able to off-ramp. So meaning that you can get into the game, you can start earning, but then once you've earned and you want to cash out, that hasn't quite been figured out yet. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah, just imagine if you went shopping in a shopping mall and you bought something, but you couldn't get change back for it. Like I think at a certain stage, you're either going to get really tired of it, or you're going to want to look for something else to do with your money. And as much as, shopping is fun for people, as the example that I use, again, if that were to happen over and over again, and there was no way for you to exit out, so to speak, or get your change back, or make an exchange or a refund, at some stage the fun runs out, in my opinion. And I think this is why in-game assets are really important for a game. In-game cosmetics, whether they're skins or assets, whether they're weapons, are really important to a game, because a lot of times, by adding these new in-game assets, it creates a little bit more stickiness for users to want to hang around in a game. A game can be really fun, but if you think about it, a hardcore gamer, if the game doesn't become competitive, so you're not able to play with other people on a server, or if there aren't nuances to it, like having really interesting in-game cosmetics to it, then, at some stage, if you play it over and over again, you're going to get bored pretty quickly. I think the average attention span for most people online is pretty low, right? So that's why it's important, actually, as a good segue, for Klaytn to be working with AAA large listed gaming studios. And that's what we do in terms of bringing games into our blockchain. We don't go out into the crypto universe looking for startups that have not really built games in the past and that are trying to experiment in creating one on chain. We actually go and work with experienced large companies that have a lot of gaming titles, because we know that they know what it takes to keep these users in there and playing. And then our job is just to ensure that we can help them integrate tokenomics into their game so that you have this, as I mentioned, corridor where you can go in game and then on chain and be able to have that exit liquidity.
Right. Yeah, because I think the payoff being that you've invested time and expertise by this point in succeeding at a game, but then you kind of want to come away with at least something at the end that you can actually use in the material world. To me, it runs akin to, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but online gambling, for instance, is that if you play a game of poker online with somebody else and you use your credit card to fund the game and then you win, well, then you get something in return for that time spent that you can spend on groceries or a new car or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, no, actually, that's even a better example than my shopping example. Like if you were to go to a casino, you put your money in, you got some chips and you won against the house and they told you, well, you can't get cash back for it. I mean, it really messes up the whole dynamics. And right. I think this is where gaming is sort of where it's hit its ceiling, in that valuations could be in literally the trillions if this could be figured out. Wow. I think that, by incorporating and integrating token assets into a game, whether they're represented by, some sort of cosmetic like a skin or a weapon, really opens up to the idea that now you have gaming assets that can be fungible. It can be taken outside of the game. You can put it on a blockchain. You can sell it. You can stake it, and so you can even have things like earn while you're not playing. Right. So it creates a lot more options and usability when you integrate the blockchain into these games.
Yeah, most definitely. We may have sort of touched on this a little bit, but more on the LandFi Metaverse. So what is Klaytn's roadmap for Metaverse projects at this point?
Yeah, we kind of look at Metaverse as a wrapper. And in that wrapper, you can have various different use cases. So our 3 prioritized use cases are gaming as a metaverse, right? Then we have entertainment as a metaverse use case. And then the last one is we have creator markets and having virtual environments where people can kind of exhibit their creations. So those are the 3 that we focus in on. On the gaming side, we kind of know where that's going. We've seen metaverse-based games, whether it be Roblox or Minecraft or Fortnite. So we've seen that. It's just taking it to another level where, again, having the integration of on-chain assets into the game make it much more interesting. So that's sort of the gaming metaverse use case for us. And then in the entertainment side, we really are looking at it from the angle of, what if you had concerts, like really big concerts in the metaverse, or if you had big conventions in the metaverse, or you had fan meetings for large, professional sports teams in the metaverse. And, the possibility then of using NFT as a different use case, using NFTs as tickets, for instance. So we kind of explore that and make that a priority as a secondary use case. And then last but not least is, we really think that with the NFT, the current NFT drive and where that's all going, we really believe that we're going to be seeing sort of what I would call like a YouTube moment for the next Justin Bieber, right? So if YouTube wasn't there, Justin Bieber wouldn't exist. And I think blockchain is going to create this moment for a lot of creators who've been under the shadows and haven't really had an opportunity to showcase their creation, but also monetize on those as well. So having that and then being able to put that through a virtual environment and be able to exhibit these things and create use cases that way.
Okay. And we've already established the fact that you're an expert convincer, your work at TD Bank, but then you were also convincing taxi drivers and bartenders to receive Bitcoin for payment. So how did people react to this?
Yeah, those were the early days in Hong Kong. one thing I should add is in Hong Kong, there's something called the Bitcoin Association of Hong Kong. I was the main sort of key founding member to that. So I brought in a lot of the guys together to get that going. And so really one of the reasons why I wanted to set that up was because having walked the streets of Hong Kong and trying to get people to understand what Bitcoin was back then, this was in, late 2012, early 2013. It was really difficult. And I said to myself, the thing that we're missing is rather than me just walking the streets with my suit on, because I was still, during the day working as a banker, we needed a platform, and it had to be nonprofit, so people didn't look like we were pumping anything or, we were shilling anything. We had to look like we were agnostic to just focusing in on what this technology was about. And that's why I set that up, and really started building on this idea of getting more and more people to come to our meetups, and funding these meetups, enticing them with pizza or beer or whatever. So we had them in isolation, and we really started educating them on what Bitcoin was. So that part and parcel was a derivative outcome of me, walking around and trying to get taxi drivers to accept Bitcoin at the time. And quite frankly, it was around that time when I met Roger Ver. And it was probably the one thing that really impressed me about Roger was he was so diehard in convincing people. If Tokyo, you look at Tokyo where he was based and how much the people there really understand what Bitcoin is, it was Roger. His fingerprints are all over it. And so that grassroots movement, it was hard but necessary. And so, for me, I felt that the natural next step was to set up something like the Bitcoin Association of Hong Kong.
Very good. So interesting. Well, let's switch gears here for a moment. You mentioned that you grew up in Canada, and quite a different upbringing than one that you would find in East Asia. And you said that typically Asian parents, they push their kids into well-paying jobs and careers. And I'm curious if there was another path that had you not had their nudging and urging to go in that direction, if there was something else that you would have chosen as your life path.
Yeah, good question. I would have gone into being an entrepreneur. I actually took some time off after graduating from university to set up my own company.
What kind of company was that?
This was in 1999. It was the very first retail sort of, well, first and foremost, there was something called the shopping cart technology back then, which everyone knows about today. Like if you go on an online retailer, you buy something, it goes into your shopping cart. Right. Back in 1999, there were only two companies that had figured out how to build a shopping cart online. It was eBay and Amazon. My team and I were the only team in Canada in 1999 who built one from scratch. And so we created something called needimports.com. It was a online retailer, essentially bringing in very cool, neat things from around the world that you couldn't buy in Canada. The problem back then, Layla, was that Canadians were more conservative, and so they weren't willing to give their Visa number online in 1999. In the US, they were a little bit more risk-taking, and so I think this is how eBay and Amazon, they were able to take off. And so after a couple of years, and my parents were just like, you gotta get into a corporate job here. You can't keep doing this. After a couple of years, although we tried hard, we just couldn't get the mass adoption. And so I moved, that's when I moved on to start my corporate career.
Oh, wow. Well, it sounds like you did have a foundation of understanding, technologically speaking, with the internet. So it sounds like once you became a banker and then you started to adopt the whole cryptocurrency idea, is that those two things eventually were married and went hand in hand for you.
Yeah, I got on one of the first ever chat applications called ICQ. And I remember that experience like it was yesterday. Real-time communication without using a phone, just in front of your computer. It was fascinating to me. And I thought to myself, if this is what the internet can do, at the time I was wondering, well, how much more could there possibly be? Obviously, I didn't know, but at the time when you're seeing that you can just real time speak to someone in the US just by chatting with them on ICQ without having to call them and pay for that call, it was really astonishing to me. And so that was the beginning of where I felt the texture of the internet, and a free internet.
Mhm.
And so when I got to understanding Bitcoin and what Bitcoin was going to do, and seeing that we were kind of moving possibly at the time from an internet of data and the exchange of data to possibly an internet of exchanging value and currencies, I just thought this thing is going to be huge.
Mhm.
And there was no way that the banks and the governments were going to turn away from it, because
Sure.
once people figured out that they could send value instantly and for near free, I mean,
Mhm.
even now when you think of that, it's just incredible.
Sure.
So yeah, and for me, being in banking for almost 20 years, I at the later stage of my banking career after the financial crisis, I always thought having a basic bank account should be like a utility, like having electricity, right?
Absolutely.
And that you shouldn't be overcharged to have a bank account, right? But that's therein is where the problem lay, was that the banks were charging a lot of money for not just opening up bank accounts and service charges monthly, but also charges for transmitting money.
Mhm.
And so it was doomed, in my mind, it was doomed to fail, because if the internet did really pick up on this, and we were willing to adopt the transmission of value over the internet, then the banks would ultimately have a hard time.
Sure, sure. Well, it sounds like your parents were very influential in pushing you into the finance career that you had for so many years. Can you tell us a little bit more about your mom and your dad? And do you have any siblings?
Yeah, I've got an older brother. My mother is still in Toronto. I grew up in Toronto. My father passed away when I was in high school. But yeah, no, I mean, they were the first generation of immigrant Asians in Canada. I'm a little bit older. I'm 47 this year, so I was in Canada from the age of 3 until I was sort of my mid to late 20s when I left. And it was interesting growing up there with immigrant parents. It was different then than it is now, I would say. I mean, there were less immigrants at the time, but that was really, when I think back on it now, that's what was really good about it.
Yeah.
Because today I jokingly say to my friends in Canada who have kids like I do, their public school is great. I mean, it's like a United Nations. It's full of multiculturalism, and I think that's fantastic.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, I think, from an identity standpoint, there's a bit of dilution in terms of what I know Canada to be,
Mhm.
which was, ice hockey, which was, beavers and all these different things. And now it's so multicultural, which is great. Don't get me wrong.
Sure.
But you start losing a bit of the identity that I grew up on, which was the real Canadiana, from my perspective anyway. So it's a different place now. My mother is happily living in Toronto. She won't move back to Asia, but I'm pretty comfortable here in Asia now.
Yeah. So you're living in Singapore now?
I'm in Singapore now. I've been here for 8 years. I was in Hong
Mhm.
Kong for 5. Really unfortunate things, how things are turning out in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has such an energy and a spirit to it. I always say that Hong Kong reminds me a lot of New York,
Mm.
and Singapore reminds me a lot of LA.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah,
Really?
it's
I
very
don't think
laid
I've ever
back.
heard anyone say that before.
Yeah, it's very laid back in Singapore.
Only a lot
In Hong
cleaner.
Kong, yeah, yeah. Well, there's that, but in Hong Kong, it just feels like a real city. Like,
Yeah.
when you go to New York and you ask for a cup of coffee, and they're like right in front of your face, right? Like in terms of
Right.
serving you.
Yes.
And Hong Kong's like that, and you don't realize that spirit that's there until you leave. And it's really unfortunate, but it's sad to see what's happening there.
I think I understand what you're saying. I was born and raised in Los Angeles and I lived for several years in New York. So I know the difference between the two, but I don't think I've ever heard of Singapore being described as an LA type town. Do you see yourself staying?
Yeah, if I'm going to be honest, I'm here raising the kids, and obviously I've got work. It's a very easy place to raise kids in Singapore. It's very safe, very clean. But obviously I've got work here as well. But in the long run, once the kids move on to university, my long-term goal is to actually move to Africa. I was an early investor into some African projects. I met a guy named Ernest, who is Cameroon Canadian, 9 years ago through Bitcoin. And he and I became very, very good friends. And he really started educating me on the history of Africa and what colonialism did to Africa and is still doing. And I remember saying to myself, well, what could I do to help? I mean, it just feels like people in Africa, for the most part, are getting screwed, right? If I'm blunt about it. And so he and I decided that we were going to set up a company. I would fund it. So I'm investor number one into these two companies that he set up. And, fast forward 4 or 5 years later, they're doing quite well. His company is the company that is working with the Central Bank of Nigeria on the CBDC project there. They have the largest bank in Africa signed on with them as a partner. They have Visa who signed on as a partner. So there's a lot going on. And Africa, to me, I think is going to be the very first $1 trillion crypto market. I don't think it's going to be Asia. I don't think it's going to be the US. It's not going to be Latin America. It's not going to be Europe. I think it's going to be Africa.
Wow. And so Africa is a very big place. Would you see yourself settling in Nigeria, or is there another country that?
Yeah. So our company and our office is in Lagos, Nigeria. So definitely we'll be traveling in there. I think myself, though, I'll be based, at least the plan for now is to base myself in Rwanda.
Oh, okay. Wow. That's a huge shift from East Asia.
Well, they are modeling. Rwanda is modeling itself after Singapore. So there's a lot of similarities in what they're doing and how they operate. But, I prefer the eastern part of Africa. And so I would rather be based there and then traveling into the office, into Lagos from time to time.
Oh, so fascinating. Well, I just have a few more questions for you. And these are just fun little questions,
Sure.
David. But what do you wish you knew in your 20s that maybe you know today?
Wow, that's a great question. I think, what I would say, working with people who have not just high IQ, but high EQ. It's not something I really thought about in my 20s. I just thought if you're really smart, I wanted to kind of be near you, work with you, etc. But in fact, it's the high IQ people with low EQ who are quite toxic, at least in my experience. I mean, this is all of banking. So in crypto, what I found was I met a lot of high IQ, high EQ people.
Oh, interesting.
And what happens then is that you have a lot of smart people who are doing things for the right reasons, and it spurns a lot of collegialism in how you solve problems, and therefore problems get solved better and faster. Which is why banking is still legacy, and it won't get out of it because there is no motivation or incentives for people to work together to solve problems.
Very interesting. All right. What talents do you possess that a lot of people don't know about?
Wow. That's a good question. Well, I would say I've had a really good run in making good calls on technology before they arrive, as well as, other different investment opportunities. So for instance, I got involved in Bitcoin pretty early. People were sort of laughing at me back in the day in 2012. even prior to that, in 1999, just getting involved with, building shopping carts that early on in Canada.
Yeah.
Also, sort of my foresight with investing in Africa. Africa is a big hot topic these days for crypto guys. So, me being there 4 or 5 years earlier is really helpful in that regard. And I've just made some pretty good investments and have had some really good vision around where I am seeing or where I saw crypto go. And I think part and parcel, that's why the founders of Kakao have asked me to come here. I think they were lacking a little bit of that vision. And so, prior to me arriving, they were spending a lot of time building DeFi around their infrastructure and architecture. And I've come in and I've kind of shifted that to get them to focus in on gaming and Metaverse and NFTs, as I mentioned earlier. So I would say that would be maybe my superpower, other than being able to eat really spicy food and not show that it's spicy.
And good at hockey too.
Yeah. I played a lot of hockey. I started in grade 2 and I didn't finish till my first year of university. So
wow. So it's probably safe to say that you're probably the best hockey player in all of Singapore.
It could be. I haven't played in a long time. I did play one game out here, and I will say the quality was not that great, so I stopped playing. But Hong Kong surprisingly had some very competitive ice hockey, believe it or not.
Really?
A lot of Canadians there. Yeah, a lot of Canadians there.
So I've heard. I have heard that. Well, finally, David, 2022, we're not quite halfway through just yet. So any projects that you're hoping to see launch or get off the ground before the end of the year? And where do you see yourself, besides moving to Africa, maybe in the next several years, but maybe in the next 5 years? What are you hoping to see just in the cryptocurrency space and in what you're producing there?
Yeah, we're really interested in projects that are leveraging what we call dynamic NFT technology. So this is where a lot of the NFTs today are very static, but we strongly believe that that's going to evolve to NFT assets that shapeshift and change and morph as data comes into the asset. So an example of this, just to make it real, is there was an NBA basketball player who was Rookie of the Year last year. He launched an NFT, dynamic NFT asset, whereby his NFT changed throughout the year as his statistics during the year of playing changed. And so when you think about assets like that, you can have real intraday changes like you can without sort of speculation, because this is real market data, so to speak, kind of feeding the asset. So if his 3-point percentage from day 1 to day 3 went up by 30%, that could have a tremendous impact on the value of the asset real time. And rather than, having a Bored Ape that goes up by 30% just because there's some, shilling or, pumping of the asset itself. So it becomes very different. The game changes. And so we're really interested in this. More importantly, we're interested in dynamic NFTs. So, in terms of gaming, because if you had, let's say, a weapon as a dynamic NFT that could be represented on chain, as you are playing the game and you're, let's say, getting more kills with the weapon could grow and become bigger, right? Which would increase the value of the weapon itself. So there's a lot of these things, or even a skin, like if you are, your health is increasing in the game, then the skin can get bigger and stronger. And so there's a lot of these opportunities that I think come with integrating and leveraging dynamic NFT technology into not just gaming, but other use cases. So really excited about that. In terms of where I kind of see, crypto in five years or so, I really see, over the next 2 years, a lot of Web2 companies converting into Web3. Wow. This was always sort of the big dream for crypto guys to try and get more mass adoption. And I kind of see the window opening now where I feel more and more Web2 companies are coming to build Web3 applications. I think most of us are sensing this. So that's the real opportunity over the next 2 years, is to be able to work as an industry with the traditional Web2 companies and help bridge and build so that we can gain more of that traditional adoption into crypto and blockchain.
So fascinating. David Shin, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a fascinating and enjoyable discussion with you.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Blockchain All Stars. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again next time.